Let me tell you about our speakers tonight. David Cannadine matriculated at Clare in 1969, along with Alan. He read history and has gone on to be one of the most, probably the most distinguished Clare historian of his generation. He was knighted for his service to scholarship in 2009 and is a tireless advocate and supporter of Clare. He was elected an honorary fellow of the college in 2012. David is joining us tonight from Princeton, which he joined in 2008, and is the Dodge Professor of History there. He's also a visiting professor at another university that we never name. He is also president of the British Academy, a role he has held since 2017, and he's previously held positions at Cambridge, Columbia, and London universities. David has written and edited over 25 books. It's probably over 30 now. I think the Princeton website is a little out of date. And his interest range widely across economic, social, political history of modern Britain and its empire, capitalism, collecting and philanthropy in the 19th and 20th century America, and the history of history. He has led or served on too many boards and advisory bodies to possibly list tonight. We enjoy seeing and hearing David regularly on television and radio, and I particularly enjoyed Buzzwords on Radio 4 recently, which has featured his work. Tonight, he's going to speak with our co-presenter about one of the most important institutions in our country, Westminster Abbey. He's uniquely qualified to do so, having edited last year's Westminster Abbey, A Church in History, and serving as vice chair of the Westminster Abbey Fabric Commission. Joining David is Jamie Hockey, Clare's Dean and Dawson Theology from 2015 to 2019. Jamie is now a By Fellow of Clare, and whilst his tenure was too short for all those who miss him, we know that he's going to remain a strong friend of Clare. Jamie left Clare to become canon theologian at Westminster Abbey and a chaplain to Her Majesty the Queen and chair of the Westminster Abbey Institute. He is also a visiting lecturer of King's College London. Jamie read theology at Girton before proceeding to his MPhil and PhD degrees as a Gosden Scholar at Selwyn. Ordained a deacon and a priest in 2008, much of his current teaching and research is in ecclesiology and ecumenical theology. He trained for the priesthood at Westcott House and then spent a semester at the Angelicum University in Rome and served his curacy in inner-city Portsmouth at St. Mary Portsea. He was appointed a minor canon and sacrist of Westminster Abbey in 2010, becoming precentor there in December 2013. Having called the Abbey home for over 6 years, we are fortunate to have him joining David tonight. David is going to speak first, and Jamie is going to join him in conversation. That will leave time for question and answers at the end and conversation amongst our group. And I'm grateful for both of them for their dedication to Clare and for joining us this evening. David and Jamie.
Well, Bill, thank you very much. I think actually Jamie and I are going to talk together, or if not simultaneously, are going to kind of converse together for much of this time. I'm hoping Jamie will do most of the talking since the Abbey is his place of work and of worship. So he, of course, knows a great deal more about it than I do. Certainly, he knows much more about its current purpose and work and functions, and indeed the challenges which, like Clare, it faces in the light of the COVID virus, by which we are all so disconcerted, even as we are seeking to get on with things. I come to this issue, as Bill has just said, by virtue of sitting on the Westminster Abbey Fabric Committee, and having become engaged with that, thanks to the then Dean John Hall, I was asked if I would preside over editing a history of Westminster Abbey to come out last October 2019 to mark the 750th anniversary of the completion of Henry III's church. And much of the Abbey today, not all of it, is Henry III's great creation, and he is one of its great architectural patrons. And what I tried to do in corralling the whole group of immensely distinguished historians into writing this book was to produce a kind of seamless narrative across the centuries, where you didn't really notice you were moving from one author to another and one chapter to another, and to try to situate the Abbey, because of its extraordinary history, in the life of the English, then the British nation, in the life of the British Empire, in the life of the Commonwealth, and in the broader ecumenical world where it has been so important in recent years. And since most of the contributions are not by me, but by other people, I think I can say that we managed to bring that off. And I suppose just before Jamie joins this conversation, and it therefore upscales considerably, some of the things that interested me in surveying the whole of this book, most of it, I must repeat, written by other people, are the kind of extraordinary paradoxes and unexpected turns and twists to the story that the Abbey as it is now was not what it was intended to be, even when Henry III built his great church. It's important to remember that it starts life in a way as a great outwork of Catholic Christendom, but it's become, in our own time and across centuries from the Reformation, a bastion of Protestant identity. That's not how it started out. It's seen very much as a great embodiment of English or perhaps British architecture. And yet much of the architecture, the apsidal East End, Henry VII's extraordinary Lady Chapel, is very French and very European in its inspiration. And although I think it is an unrivaled house of kings in terms of the array of tombs from Edward the Confessor to George II, it's actually the grave of an unknown ordinary person, the tomb of the unknown warrior, which I think most people now go and see. And of course, when any head of state comes to London, they always go, even Donald Trump, they always go to the Abbey to lay a wreath at that grave. And also a kind of final paradox for now, it is a very sacred building where, as Jamie knows far better than I, the daily round of worship still goes on and is in a sense its prime function. But it is also a very secular building, the most secular sacred building in Britain, if I can put it that way, partly because of the centuries-long historical connection with Westminster, with Parliament, which sat in the chapter house in medieval times. Also, of course, its connection with monarchs. Only 2 monarchs have not been crowned in Westminster Abbey since the time of William the Conqueror. So it's also a very secular building as well as a very sacred building. And the tension, or the balance between those different functions is a major driver to the whole of its history across more than a millennium. It is, I think, the most special and remarkable building in Britain, with the possible exception of the Tower of London. And although I suppose it could be argued that it's rivaled by Notre Dame, Chartres, Reims in France, St. Peter's in Rome, perhaps the National Cathedral in Washington, I think the range of historical associations, the continuity across such a long span of the connections between church and state, its extraordinary role as a pantheon, as an imperial Valhalla, makes it in many ways the most astonishing and remarkable church in the whole of Western Christendom. And I feel enormously privileged to have had a very small but greatly valued association with it. Jamie, over to you.
Thank you, David. It's a huge joy to be here this evening with a lot of friends, and with David, who not only is a friend, but of course also such a distinguished friend and colleague to the Abbey. So what I'm going to do now is just to say a little bit about the Abbey's contemporary life as a way of offering a sort of springboard back into some historical reflections. Westminster Abbey is a kind of palimpsest. It's a palimpsest on which so much has been written, erased, and rewritten. And its 21st century life is really a cocktail which is mixed around the core of daily worship, which has been the heartbeat of this place since at least 960. Even during this time of pandemic, there are 20 daily services each week. Now, one story which the Dean Emeritus of Westminster, John Hall, tells in the introduction to this brilliant history relates to the events of the 22nd of March 2017, which was the day of the Westminster Bridge terror attacks. The Abbey was asked by Parliament to offer refuge to members of both houses and staff immediately after the first attack on Westminster Bridge. The Abbey became a place of sanctuary and community for Westminster, as it's been for centuries, but this time with perhaps a rather hackneyed Anglican mix of cups of warm tea and prayers on the hour. But that story immediately encapsulates something of the creative tension which is at the heart of this place, a cocktail of sacred and secular. Now, there's no such thing as a regular day in the life of Westminster Abbey, but for the fact that it's almost always a mixture of worship and public engagement. A quick look at the annual list of our big special services will tell you quite a lot about our regular and ongoing relationships with the Crown and Parliament, the armed forces, the legal and nursing professions, volunteering in the UK, and of course, a particularly strong connection with the Commonwealth. Every single Commonwealth High Commissioner comes to the Abbey on their national day each year to read a lesson at evensong. And once a year, on Commonwealth Day, the second Monday of March, there's a colourful and vibrant service thought to be the UK's largest interfaith gathering, which is always based around a theme chosen by the Commonwealth Secretariat. So this deeply British institution with international dimensions. There are other international dimensions too. We've recently started to build educational links with the wider Anglican Communion. As David has already said, whenever there's a state visit to the Queen, the state visitor always comes to lay a wreath. The centenary, of course, of the burial of the unknown warrior takes place in just under a fortnight's time. But these international connections are also curated through our learning department, an extensive archive and collections department, the Abbey's world-famous music and its iconic architecture. I suspect even before we were all forced into a greater degree of online intensity through this pandemic, the Abbey's reach was already more international than it's ever been. When President Obama visited here, I have to confess I was on a little boat floating off the Western Isles of Scotland when President Trump came. That was actually an accident. But when President Obama came, I was here. And he was told by one of my colleagues that the 3,300 people buried or memorialized in Westminster Abbey testify to the history and culture of England. No, Obama said very quickly as he stopped. This place treasures the history and culture of the English-speaking world. A few years ago, another visitor, a German Benedictine abbot, told me that he'd always thought of Westminster Abbey as a mausoleum, really just another version of the Pantheon in Paris. But I think two things make it slightly more particular than that, or a bit different. The first is the liturgical context of everything we do. As well as being the site of a memorial to that unknown warrior, it's also a place of pilgrimage to a royal saint. And if you can picture the Abbey with the warrior at the far west end by the door, if I move my head, you can probably see the grave with its blood-red poppies. At the other end of the church is the shrine of St. Edward at the east, behind the altar. And I sometimes reflect that these two very different burials represent the poles of the Abbey's life. Memorialization, national memory, absolutely, but also worship and proclamation with a strong commitment to public service and hospitality. So one last feature of Westminster Abbey's contemporary life before David takes us on a bit of a tour of its history. In 2013, we founded the Westminster Abbey Institute, which I now have the privilege to chair. And that body exists to promote moral and spiritual values in public life and to think about what kind of virtues are necessary for public service in the 21st century. To explain this, I'd like you to imagine Parliament Square. You have the Palace of Westminster with both Houses of Parliament to the east, Whitehall and the Supreme Court to the north, and the Abbey, which of course was here before anything else, to the south. So working with our neighbours around Parliament Square, we now host an annual series of public lectures and private seminars on these themes. And we run a fellows programme for young public servants drawn from the political realm, the charitable sector, civil servants, educators, the military, the police, and religion. This programme is open to those of all faiths and none, and represents our strong desire to speak of faith at the heart of the nation and to help inspire virtue and service right across public life. It's also somewhere where the Chatham House rule can be properly operative, and where truth can speak to power. So if I can open up more of a conversational element. My first question to David, coming out of all this, would be what has led up to this point? Perhaps you can help us through some of the 20th century and its hinges.
Well, yes, Jamie, and thank you for that immensely vivid account, which certainly chimes with my own experience of what the Abbey is doing today and why, even in the world of COVID, it remains so central to the life of the nation, indeed in some ways more so than ever. Well, a quick canter through the 20th century, if I can put it that way, with the obvious opening proviso that I don't think anybody alive in 1900 would have expected the Abbey to be quite where it was in 2000. As Arthur Schlesinger once said, the future defies all our certitudes, and the way the Abbey evolved across the 20th century is not, I think, the way that people in the first decade of the 20th century would have expected it to do. And I think by the same token, what the Abbey will be like 100 years from now is anybody's guess, but it certainly won't be entirely like it is today. A few themes. First of all, I think the theme of empire to commonwealth. It's important to remember that the coronations of Edward VII, George V, George VI, and indeed the present Queen in 1953 were all of them grand, self-conscious, deliberate imperial occasions in a way that Queen Victoria's coronation, a long time before Edward VII's, hadn't been. And that sense that the British monarch was not just being crowned as King of England or Queen of England or of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, but as either the Emperor or Empress of India, as the head of a worldwide empire, or in the case of the current Queen, as head of the Commonwealth, which was the new word that was coming in, even though most of the British Empire remained intact, only, as it were, South Asia having become independent. And remember, for example, the coronation march that William Walton composed for the coronation of George VI and Queen Elizabeth was, of course, called Crown Imperial. It's hard to believe that a coronation march composed for King Charles III, as I suppose he would be, would have the same title as that. Because, of course, what has happened in the Abbey, and reflecting these broader national trends in the second half of the 20th century, has been the dissolution of the British Empire almost completely, and its evolution into the Commonwealth. And if one looks at some of the memorials in the cloisters of the Abbey, they are to the end of the colonial service, to the end of the Indian civil service, recognising that that phase in the nation's history is over. If one thinks of Lord Mountbatten's funeral, which took place in the Abbey, he was the last Viceroy of India, the last of the great Second World War military commanders. Britain has evolved into a much less global world power in the formal sense of empire or a great navy, or as it were, the richest economy in the world. And the evolution of the Commonwealth and the shift from empire to Commonwealth is, I think, very well reflected across the 20th century in the Abbey's history. And back to the point I began with, most people believed in 1900 that the empire was going to be permanent. And one of the problems that they were faced with in 1900 was there are so many more imperial heroes, the Abbey's full up, where are we going to put them? And so extraordinary schemes are devised for a kind of imperial Valhalla, which would be, as it were, an extension of the Abbey, roughly where the statue of George V now stands. There was going to be a 500-foot tower, which would have dwarfed the Abbey and indeed the Houses of Parliament, and lots of chapels for regimental memorials and for burial places for or memorials to great British imperial proconsuls and adventurers and other figures. It's perhaps rather a good thing that those schemes never got anywhere, because they would certainly look rather ridiculous and out of date now, because the empire hasn't lasted in the way that the advocates and proponents of those schemes thought it would. And so that's one of the ways in which nobody, I think, in the 1900s would have foreseen the evolution from empire to Commonwealth, the diminished role of Britain as a great power in the world, but nevertheless the enhanced role, I think, of British soft power throughout the English-speaking world. And all this, of course, is reflected in the Abbey. Worth mentioning, of course, there is a monument to Franklin Roosevelt in the Abbey, just on the right-hand side of the west door as you come in, which was dedicated in the presence appropriately of both Clement Attlee and Winston Churchill. A second theme which follows on from that is that the Abbey is, of course, chock-a-block with statues and memorials, most of them, once we get beyond the era of the royal tombs, from the 18th and especially the 19th centuries. There's that extraordinary bit in the South Transept in particular, where Gladstone and Disraeli are looking at each other, appropriately discomfited by this not wholly happy vista for them. But in particular in the 19th century, the great cult of individual statues to great men. And the problem which the Imperial Valhalla was meant to solve, but didn't, of an abbey chock-a-block with statues, gave rise to an alternative solution because the Imperial Valhalla wasn't built. And that, of course, is the memorial tablets, which are now such a feature, as it were, of the abbey's floor, that has been the new way of commemorating great figures. No longer burials in the abbey, no longer great statues, but occasionally the interment of ashes, as in the case of Stephen Hawking, and frequently memorial tablets, the one of Winston Churchill, for instance, not appropriately not far from the grave of the unknown warrior. And so that rather less grandiose form of commemoration in the 20th century, partly driven by the sheer necessity that all the wall space was taken up, but there was floor space, so you could do these memorial tablets. Remember, as you come in on the left-hand side, there are the memorial tablets to British prime ministers. That shift, both in, as it were, the necessity to downsize commemoration, but also perhaps in a world where we don't venerate heroes as much as we did, is another major theme of the 20th century. A third one, I think, is, of course, the growth of the return of royal weddings to Westminster Abbey. When Catherine Middleton and the Duke of Cambridge, as he became, got married, people said this was an example of a centuries-old tradition. In fact, it's a tradition which goes only back to 1919. There were no royal weddings in Westminster Abbey between 1486 and 1919. And it was Dean Ryle, I think the Abbey's most significant 20th century dean, who has a major hand in bringing back across a gap of centuries royal weddings into the Abbey, beginning with Princess Patricia of Connaught marrying Captain the Honourable Alexander Ramsay, then Viscount Lascelles marrying Queen Mary, and then the most famous early one of these new, as it were, innovative weddings, the Duke of York marrying Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. And that's the origin of this allegedly centuries-old tradition of royal weddings in the Abbey. It is, in fact, not yet a century old. And that made the Abbey a place of public interest where ordinary people, themselves often getting married, could see in the Abbey a kind of larger-than-life version of what many of them had gone through or aspired to go through. And that made the Abbey a place, perhaps in a way, of kind of glamour and aspiration. But Ryle's other brilliant insight was that repurposing of the Abbey in the 20th century went along with this idea of genius of the grave of the unknown warrior, which became a place of extraordinary pilgrimage, where people who had lost sons, fathers, husbands, brothers, nephews in the war could go and, as it were, grieve and perhaps identify with the unknown warrior. And it was that sense that on the one side, the Abbey provided comfort and consolation for ordinary people, even as it did royal glamour as well. That combination, which Ryle brilliantly sees, is somehow just right for the mood of the 1920s, I think repurposed the 20th century Abbey in a very powerful and very important way. And I suppose the final theme is, and in a sense it certainly relates to the Commonwealth theme, the growth of the Abbey as a centre and focus and leader in the second half of the 20th century of ecumenicalism. The Abbey, as many of you may know, has this extraordinary status of being a royal peculiar. There is no bishop. The Abbey is responsible only to the monarch, who is the visitor of the Abbey. And as a result of that, it's possible for the Abbey to hold services embodying faiths other than the Protestant faith, which no other Church of England church is allowed to do, apart from other royal peculiars, which we won't go into. And so in particular, as Jamie has already mentioned, the development of this Commonwealth Day service in the second half of the 20th century, as a display of multiculturalism in terms of the nations, the ethnicities of the Commonwealth, but also as a multi-faith display, is one of its most extraordinary developments in the second half of the 20th century, again, I think, which no one could otherwise have foreseen. And a further embodiment of that on the West Front are the monuments, I think it's to 10 20th century Christian martyrs, and they are martyrs of many faiths beyond the Church of England. So that's a very, very brief scamper through the 100 years of the Abbey's 20th century history, which, as I say, I think came out by the 1990s in a very different way from how they started in the 1900s, and helped perhaps to get us, that provides, as it were, the immediate historical background to the description of contemporary Abbey life that Jamie has already provided.
If I could just pick up on a couple of those themes, namely the curation of identity and the invention of tradition. Some of what David has mentioned there, I think really offer examples of how identity can be curated in quite a subtle way. Certainly at the time of the Black Lives Matter movement, I was struck more forcibly than ever before, walking in through the Great West Door of Westminster Abbey, that the presence of these 10 martyrs of the 20th century above the West Door, from every corner of the globe, from all sorts of human cultures, spoke quite directly into that moment. Here you have the Coronation Church, one of the centerpieces of British establishment, if you like, and the people who welcome you in are not, as at Chartres, the figure of Our Lady with the apostles, but are these 10 individuals from different cultures, different parts of the world. I think that says something quite interesting about contemporary Anglicanism, and also about what the contemporary Church of England might be, as it were, slightly untrammeled from its established capital E nature. David mentioned the fact that the Abbey is a royal peculiar. Of course, its roots as a peculiar go back, I think, at least to the 12th century, when the Abbey became a papal peculiar. So many of you will know the Cosmati pavement, which rests just in front of the high altar of Westminster Abbey. Many historians have questioned why on earth that might be there. We think the reason is that the abbot who's buried on the left of the sacrarium was in Rome to have his election confirmed by the Pope, and sent word to Henry III that he'd found this extraordinary artistic centerpiece for his new church, built as a shrine to the confessor. So the Abbey is papal peculiar, proceeded through at least 350 years. And then when Henry VIII dissolved the monastery, he simply abrogated that to himself, as he did so much when Elizabeth I refounded us as a collegiate church, that is not a monastic establishment, but a community, much of it non-resident, which sustains its life with a dean and canons, but also librarians and directors of music, choristers, clerks of the work. That organization, if you like, that ecclesiastical organization, remained answerable only to the ordinary, not the Pope, but the sovereign. I think the way in which that cashes out in terms of not being answerable to prevailing institutional ecclesial culture is very important. We've both commented on the example of the Commonwealth Day, when you can see an imam and rabbi leading prayers from their own traditions. Another example is a few years ago, at the height of sensitivities, the Abbey was the place which could host the Dalai Lama for a moment of interfaith encounter in the UK. Perhaps most profoundly, alongside London's Jewish community, we've hosted large commemorations of the anniversary of Kristallnacht, and most recently, the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Just a couple of other points. David, in discussing something about empire and commonwealth, touched on the transformation of the monarchy. In some ways, the Abbey has assisted, I think, in that rather subtle turn of the prism away from imperialism symbolized by orb and scepter, by crown, towards a sense of the monarchy being much more geared to public service itself. When we celebrated the Queen's Diamond Jubilee here a few years ago, the central image was not the crown, although the crown of St. Edward rested on the altar. It was instead a small phial of oil that was processed through the Abbey to represent the anointing of the sovereign. So I think the subtle turn from orb and scepter to the oil of anointing has been quite symbolically important. David, I wonder if I can ask you another question.
It depends what it is, but go ahead, go ahead.
We've already touched on many histories of Westminster Abbey, monastic, establishment, Commonwealth. Do you think it's possible to speak of historical coherence here?
Well, I think the answer has to be, in a rather mealy-mouthed way, yes and no. I mean, the coherence is that a large part of the Abbey's building today remains the church that Henry III built. And so there is a sense in which there is serious continuity because buildings survive and outlive the people who built them. On the other hand, buildings often also outlive the purpose for which they were originally constructed. And that is part of what is so interesting about the Abbey. It must be repeated. It was built originally. Henry III's building is, of course, the third on the site, as a Benedictine monastery, as part of Catholic Christendom. That isn't what it is now. It's still a place of Christian worship. And in that sense, there is very serious continuity, but in other ways not. And if we go back to the point you made about the royal peculiar, it is important to notice that nobody at the beginning of the 16th century would have thought that by the end of that century, Westminster Abbey would be a Protestant church, a royal peculiar answerable only to the monarch. It was still a part of Catholic Europe. And the hinge period in the Abbey's history, where it goes in a completely different direction from what might have been expected on the basis of the centuries of its previous history, is of course the Tudor period. Henry VIII, as you say, dissolves the monasteries. He doesn't wreck the abbey. He converts it into a cathedral church, which briefly does have a bishop. But then, of course, under Queen Mary, it goes back to being a Benedictine abbey again, as the pendulum of religious conflict, if such a mixed metaphor can be forgiven, swings back and forth. And of course, it's in 1560, after Mary has died, Elizabeth, her half-sister, becomes queen. It's Elizabeth who establishes it as a royal peculiar. So the history, as it were, of the abbey, beginning in the later part of the 16th century, is very different from how it was before. And that could not, I think, have been foreseen. And then there's a further rupture, if I can put it that way, in the middle of the 17th century. The Stuarts, of course, closely identify with the Abbey. The first Stuart monarch, James I, brings his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, and has her reburied close to the tomb of Elizabeth to show the kind of connection between them, such as it was. It was a very royal church, a Protestant church, of course. But then, of course, comes along the Civil War. And during the interregnum, the House of Kings is for a time superseded by the House of Regicides. And monuments are put up to people like Oliver Cromwell, who stand for a completely different tradition in terms of how you organize a country than the tradition embodied by the tombs of the monarchs. The monarchs, of course, do then come back. Cromwell is dug up, taken off to the Tower and hanged, although he's already dead, so it's not quite clear what that would accomplish, but that's what they did. And so the interregnum was kind of papered over, if I can put it that way. But for a time, in the middle of the 17th century, it looked as though the Abbey was again going in a very different direction. So although there is a huge amount of continuity in the sense that it has always been a place of worship, the mode of worship, the denomination of worship has shifted. The building has remained extraordinarily continuous in some ways. But there have been these extraordinary points at which it's gone in a completely different direction. And while the different directions it went in the 20th century are nothing like as violent as the ones in Tudor and Stuart times, I must repeat, the Abbey by the end of the 20th century was in many ways very different. And I suspect that at the end of the 21st century, it'll be different again. But I do the past, not the future, and that's more than enough to be going on with.
Very few people in Anglican church circles would have thought of the artist formerly known as Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, as being a natural reconciler. But there's a rather wonderful story about when he visited here in 2010, the first Pope ever to visit Westminster Abbey. As he was greeted at the Great West Door, the 20th century martyrs were pointed out to him, and he immediately isolated Dietrich Bonhoeffer. There you have this German Catholic Pope coming into an Anglican church, highlighting the role of a Lutheran martyr as he entered. He came in the building, the Abbey choir was singing. His face was like an excited child. Of course, Ratzinger is a very fine musician, very good pianist. And as a result of that encounter, the Abbey choir was invited to Rome, became the first choir in the world to sing with the Sistine Chapel choir, to sing alongside the Sistine Chapel choir. And on the 29th of June, 2011, the choir of Westminster Abbey, this great royal Protestant peculiar, sang the papal mass on the feast of St. Peter and St. Paul in the Vatican Basilica with the Pope as the celebrant. And at communion, this Anglican choir sung a setting of the Ave Verum, William Byrd's Ave Verum, written for a recusant audience. And it was in that moment that I thought, maybe history can actually be healed. Maybe we can speak of the past being healed in the present. Neither William Byrd nor the Dean of Westminster at the time of the Reformation, the immediate Reformation, could possibly have foreseen that that sort of healing can happen. And in a sense, that's the genius of a place like this, that all sorts of connections can be made which are not bound by time or space. David, you touched on some of the early modern history, but I wonder whether I can tempt you slightly backwards, because, ladies and gentlemen, I really do recommend this wonderful book to you, which I'm trying to hold up now. Yale University Press, last year, Westminster Abbey, a Church in History. One of the most fascinating chapters in the book is James Clark and Paul Binsky's work entitled Plantagenet Tragedies to Tudor Triumphs. Reflecting on the Abbey's history, David, I wonder if there's a case for reversal here. Plantagenet triumphs, the building of the nave, the Jerusalem chamber, the Littlington Missal, and Tudor tragedies, thinking of course of the Abbey's dissolution in 1539. What do you think?
Well, because there are so many different histories of the Abbey, there are clearly many different ways of telling it. I mean, if we're back up to just before the Plantagenets, I mean, the story that most of us, I think, would recognize begins, of course, with Edward the Confessor. It's the Confessor who decides he's going to build a grand church at Westminster, called Westminster, of course, because it's to the west of St. Paul's, and Minster, rather like York Minster, because it's a grandiose church. And it's William the Conqueror, who may have been the second monarch to be crowned at the Abbey, and if not, was certainly the first. It's the Confessor and the Conqueror, in a sense, who set the Abbey off on what is recognizably the beginnings of the history that we know about in the intervening centuries. But there is a case, I agree, for arguing that the Plantagenets are of enormous significance. It's certainly true of Henry III, the great architectural patron. It's also Henry III, of course, who begins the cult of Edward the Confessor, culminating in him being sanctified. And it's certainly Richard II, as you also say, who builds a lot more of the nave. Richard II also, of course, the person who puts the great hammer beam roof over Westminster Hall, and the connection between the Palace of Westminster, a royal palace, and the Abbey, already peculiar in the ways that you've described, is, of course, hugely important. So one can certainly make that case. One can also make the case that Henry VIII was not a man who was particularly fond of great churches. He talked about, I mean, Westminster Abbey is not wrecked at the dissolution of the monasteries in the way that Tintern Abbey or Fountains Abbey or Rievaulx Abbey were. It was repurposed by Henry as a cathedral, and that, I think, meant it did survive. So yes, it is as ever a complicated story which can be told in many different ways.
You mentioned, David, the presence of Edward the Confessor's palace, as it were, over the river from the Abbey. Of course, it is that enriching of the Abbey by King Edward the Confessor, I think, which can represent the genesis of this highly peculiar relationship in England between church and state. I don't think establishment with a capital E begins at the Reformation. I think it can be traced right the way back, that there is this extraordinarily creative and problematic, in some ways, certainly theologically problematic, tension between church and state, which is a sort of deeply knotty inheritance now. I mean, I wonder if one of the reasons why that is important is that because it gives a certain defense, public defense of religious faith in public life. Some years ago, the Queen gave a speech at Lambeth Palace in which she said that the role of the Church of England was not to jealously guard itself and its own rights and privileges, but was rather there to protect smaller faith communities who might be at risk of isolation. And I wonder whether going forward, you think, having edited this extraordinary volume, the Abbey has something distinctive to add to public life.
Well, it certainly is true that part of what makes the Abbey so extraordinary and so unique, I think, among the great churches of the world has been this constant and constantly changing relationship with, as it were, the corridors of power. It's often forgotten that in the 13th and the 14th centuries, Parliament actually met in the Abbey's chapter house. I mean, the relationship was that close. And of course, it's important to remember that the coronation, which is the point at which a new head of state is crowned, is of course a religious sacrament. And it's also important to remember that in the course of the coronation, the monarch swears to uphold the Protestant church by law established. Which I think might turn out to be rather tricky next time round, since Britain is now a much more ecumenical and multi-faith society. And of course, that provision has a specific historic story attached to it. It's put in deliberately in 1688. Because, of course, James II was deposed because it was thought he was a closet Catholic. And the coronation oath upholding the Protestant church by law established is a way of trying to ensure no repetition of that. And it was intended to serve that specific historical purpose, but the coronation service, lots of things are added to it and nothing is taken away. So that oath is still there now. And I think that will not play well, or it will not play easily come the next coronation. A lot of people are not going to like that and wonder why it's there. So, I mean, I do take your point that the whole issue of the continued establishment of the Church of England in a multi-faith world is quite a tricky one. Of course, if the church was disestablished, I don't think there would have to be a coronation at all, or at least not one in the Abbey according to the rights of the Church of England.
No, absolutely. The whole thing would be up for grabs at that point.
Yeah.
I think, perhaps this is a good moment to draw our bit of a conversation to a close, but I think the whole business of what counts as public liturgy in the 21st century, the coronation being, if you like, right at the top of that category, what counts as public liturgy, what public liturgy is for, is a huge question culturally and religiously, but culturally more broadly, as we enter these very, very untested waters.
Yes, I would agree with that. That's part of my point, that I think it's hard to foresee what shape the Abbey's history will take for the rest of the 20th century. But it is a good bet, as it were, that part of the shaping of that history will be engaging with the sort of issues that you've just mentioned. Bill, I think you're supposed at this point, at least this is Jamie's view and therefore of course mine, you're supposed to tell us that at this point we should be quiet and we should invite others gathered here on this great occasion to make comments or ask questions.
You're right on time with that. So for people who know how to light up the participants button and then use the raise hand function, feel free to do that. If you also just want to wave and start talking, we could try it that way. It's not such a big group. And I'll try and keep things moderated. But just to get things started, Jamie, you've been at the Abbey 10 years, not consecutively because you were here, but you've been associated with the Abbey since, for a while now, and you've seen how it operates and how it starts to figure out what it's doing. I think the big theme tonight that you mentioned is that the Abbey, especially now, is a place that brings people together. From not just from one faith anymore, from all faiths to the extent it can. The work you've been doing in ecumenical work and so forth. but also that is really hard work to do right now because of what we're going through as a country and as a global community. So how is the is the Abbey managed? How do you work through these things? And I know there are financial issues and so forth. Just talk a little bit about that, and then I'm gonna keep an eye on people whose hands are up. And then I think Simon maybe will ask a question after you've answered mine.
Well, thank you, Bill, very much. Yes, as you say, we're in the midst of huge financial challenges here at the moment. Over 90% of our income comes from the paying tourist gate, and over 80% of that is international tourism. So we're having to work very, very quickly and try to be flight of foot in ensuring our core purpose. But, you know, despite the tragedies of restructuring and redundancies, which ought not to be minimized, because this is a deeply familial place. It's a place which people love and where people hold each other very dear. What has been so fundamental throughout this period has been, if I can put it this way, the daily curation of the hearth. So even at the moment when the Church of England's churches were shut and priests were banned from going into their churches, we didn't do that. We claimed that we were one household for the purposes of worship, and we were probably the only place in the UK, or in England at least, which had a full array of Holy Week ceremonies in the usual way, but with about 12 people. My wife and the director of music formed a little quartet, so we had some music. And certainly I found that this place was a place of advocacy for the nation spiritually at that moment in a way that I'd never quite experienced before. So that sense of tending the hearth is one mode that this place can offer to a country in very deep flux. The second mode, I think I would want to point to, is related to our work with Westminster Abbey Institute. We try not to get involved at all with party politics, or even in commenting on the major issues du jour, although naturally some of that will happen through preaching and so on. What we can do is to point to fundamentals. So, for example, when truth is a casualty, that has a knock-on effect for issues such as justice. And I think what we're trying to do at the moment is to uncover some of the very deep roots that relate to the character of a civilized nation, quality of debate, quality of truth-telling. And we can do that in a way, I hope, which is friendlily provocative, but also in a way which says, you know, we've been here since 960 and we're not going to go away. We're not going to stop asking those questions.
Jamie. Simon, maybe your hand is up in the official way. Please ask your question.
Well, it's a question really, perhaps for a response from both Jamie and David. Having spent a wonderful year as the Deputy High Steward of Westminster, I certainly experienced many of the wonderful national, secular and sacred occasions that Jamie was talking about. But I also experienced some also wonderful occasions at St. Paul's Cathedral. So the question really is about the relationship between Peter and Paul, both historically and in the present day. So if I remember rightly, it was always said that St. Paul's Cathedral was built by, the finance was raised by robbing Peter to pay Paul. And when we, I think, was it Jamie or David talked about Earl Mountbatten's funeral at Westminster Abbey, but of course Winston Churchill was at St. Paul's. Royal weddings sometimes take place at Westminster Abbey, but they also sometimes take place at St. Paul's. So it's really a question about the relationship between Peter and Paul over the centuries, and how does it work today, and who decides where some of these great national occasions should take place?
Well, let me give my version of this, though Jamie, as with everything else, knows much more about it. As I've said, it's interesting that much of the Abbey's history has been about it being independent from either Catholic jurisdiction other than the Pope, and the jurisdiction of the senior archbishops in the Church of England, so that gave the abbey, both in Catholic times and even more in Protestant times, a kind of independence which St. Paul's didn't have and doesn't have. So you couldn't have the Commonwealth service, for instance, taking place at St. Paul's because the Church of England wouldn't allow it, whereas in the abbey, if the Queen wants something, it happens because she's actually in charge. And that's what's driven in part or enabled the move towards ecumenicalism, which is much more evident in the Abbey than it is in St. Paul's. There was, of course, much distress at the Abbey when Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer married in St. Paul's. The Abbey felt deeply slighted, and I should think there are many reasons why that's a precedent, the St. Paul's royal wedding, which isn't going to be followed anytime soon. So the Abbey is back, as it were, so that's perhaps okay. There are a variety of conventions, of course. Nelson and Wellington and Churchill and Thatcher all had grand funerals in St. Paul's, not in the Abbey. Thatcher's wasn't a state funeral, it was a ceremonial funeral, but it was pretty grand anyway. It's also fair to say that the Abbey, that St. Paul's has therefore a close association with the Navy and with the Army. There's that set of memorials to the field marshals of the Second World War. Whereas the Air Force is much more associated with the Abbey, the annual Battle of Britain service, the Battle of Britain Chapel. Now, how these things get divided up in this way, I don't know, but perhaps Jamie does know. But they do get divided up.
They do indeed. If I can start with a good Benedictine principle of quoting one of my youngest colleagues, when our choristers, the boy choristers who sing in the choir, play a football match against Westminster Cathedral, the Catholic cathedral down the road, that's a friendly. When they play football against St. Paul's Cathedral, that's a needle match. That's when the really bad behavior starts. What I can say is that there is a really good relationship between the Dean and Chapter of Westminster and the Dean and Chapter at St. Paul's. But I think we are increasingly pretty clear about what belongs where. There's a bit of honest brokerage that goes on from time to time, no doubt a bit of jostling behind the scenes. But I think the way that we try to carve it up now, if I can put it sort of informally in this way, is that St. Paul's has the character of a sort of parish church of the nation, national occasions. So for example, the great service to celebrate the Diamond Jubilee of the accession of the Queen happened in St. Paul's Cathedral. Royal occasions tend to come to the Abbey. So for example, when we had our big Diamond Jubilee service, what we celebrated was the Diamond Jubilee of the coronation, not of the accession. St. Paul's is of course a diocesan cathedral. Its first responsibility is to the Diocese of London, to its bishops and to the parishes. So of course how St. Paul's Cathedral spends its money is a rather more diffuse and diverse series of priorities than how Westminster Abbey spends its money. Once again, we're just not subject to the same degree of pressure or scrutiny from, for example, a diocese as St. Paul's is. So yeah, a fair amount of honest brokerage. Robbing Peter to pay Paul, Simon, I think, you know, why not? But I think there is a strong sense that the two places now are engaged in the same mission, albeit with a little bit of friendly joshing from time to time.
I think it's fair to say, isn't it, insofar as these matters are known, or at least when it comes to funerals, Prince Philip is going to get St. Paul's and the Queen is going to get Westminster Abbey. Jamie has muted himself at this point. I sense he doesn't wish to comment.
Certainly the Queen's funeral will be at Westminster Abbey. I think the arrangements around the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral are rather more fluid, shall we say.
Of course, it will be interesting, and the precedent here is the Queen Mother. It will be interesting if, as we think we know, that the Queen's funeral will be at Westminster Abbey. That, of course, will be a newly invented tradition, really, because yes. Monarchs' funerals have not occurred in the Abbey for a very long time. And, of course, the model for Princess Diana's funeral was, in fact, the Queen Mother's funeral, and they adapted it.
Absolutely, as is revealed in that rather wonderful film, I think, is it just called The Queen?
Yes.
And the actress playing the Queen Mother, when she is told exactly what's going to happen for Princess Diana's funeral, says, "But that's my model."
Yeah.
Simon, that was a great question that took us to an interesting place. Um, I don't see any other hands up in the chat. Does anybody just want to raise their hand on a screen and chip in and say something? We have the time for one or two more questions before we give you some music. Andrew Garrity. Andrew, we need you to unmute.
Myself?
Yep.
Hi, Bill. Thank you. Yes, I'm sorry. Despite endless FaceTime and Zoom, I still don't know this bit about putting your hands up by the sort of protocols of the screen. Thanks first, though, both David and Jamie, for, I thought, fascinating talk. I think I've got three very quick questions, which I think are factual and therefore don't need to lead to enormous debate. Firstly, and they're not in sort of sequential order really, but I was surprised Benedict XVI was the first Catholic Pope to have visited the Abbey. 500 years when it was a Catholic Abbey, didn't see a Pope visit. I'm a little surprised at that, but I want to just check with Jamie that that's my understanding. Secondly, who were the two monarchs who weren't crowned at the Abbey? David mentioned two who didn't have their coronations there. And then thirdly, and this is slightly more difficult, back to Jamie, given our introspection about history, to what extent now is the Abbey thinking about the statues and memorial tablets of those who are commemorated in the Abbey, and particularly the 10 modern martyrs who might cause the Abbey some concern? I hope those questions were clear, and I hope I've expressed them adequately.
Well, shall I have a go first? I mean, I think it's right. I mean, I do defer to Jamie on this, having said I'll have a go first, but I don't think any pope in medieval times arrived. You know, popes didn't get out much. They didn't get far beyond Avignon, and Avignon wasn't a good place to go if you were a pope at the best of times, and they don't go much further than that. So, you know, they're just not out and about. The two monarchs not crowned, one is Edward VIII for obvious reasons. I mean, the coronation of George VI and Queen Elizabeth is, of course, Edward VIII's coronation. The other, I think, is Edward V. It's certainly another Edward, and I think it's Edward V. So that's my best try at answering your three questions.
Thank you.
I think that's right. Certainly Edward VIII, and I think Edward V. Yes, Andrew, it is true to say that Pope Benedict XVI was the first pope to visit the Abbey. Of course, he wasn't the first pope to visit England. John Paul II made a pastoral visit to the Catholic community in 1982, but the big, as it were, ecumenical focus of that trip was Canterbury Cathedral and St. Thomas Becket, rather than St. Edward and the Palace of Westminster. I ought to say there is one cardinal buried in the Abbey, Cardinal Simon Langham, who was Chancellor of England, but was also Abbot of Westminster. He was one of the Avignon cardinals, interestingly. And the night before Basil Hume was installed as Archbishop of Westminster, back in the mid-80s, the Dean and Chapter invited the monastic community of Ampleforth, which was Basil Hume's monastery, to come and sing Vespers in the Abbey the night before Cardinal Hume was enthroned in Westminster Cathedral. So extraordinarily symbolic moment there. Your final question about statues, I think one of the things we're trying to do at the moment is to be extremely clear about exactly who we have memorialized here, about what kind of people they were, about the sources of their wealth. We're not trying to do that because in any sense there's a plan to take down any statues or anything like that. In fact, when Mandela came on his state visit to England, he was shown around the Abbey by a good friend of ours. And when he was confronted with a plaque to Cecil Rhodes, this was presented with some embarrassment. Mandela is alleged to have said, if I'm ever memorialized here, I'd like to be memorialized next to Rhodes, because you can't change your history, but you can heal it. In actual fact, when we did memorialize Mandela, we put him in the nave. But I think that's possibly because that story hadn't filtered through at the time. But I think one thing that we are determined to do is to better explain and contextualize some of our monuments, partially because very many of them are not to the great and good at all. Right up to the 18th century, you could pay to be buried in Westminster Abbey. One of the best, as it were, counter-examples of this is the burial place of Ben Jonson, which is a tiny square in the nave, the great playwright, friend of Shakespeare. And it's a tiny square because he's buried vertically because that's all his family could possibly afford. So yes to contextualization and explaining monuments.
Thank you, Andrew, for that question. I was hoping we get one more in, but I'm looking, and so I see John Greenbank. A quick question, and then we're going to have to go on to the musical part of the evening because I promised Jamie he could be away. I have to unmute, John.
I would just like to tie things together. The Masters and Allen's comments right at the beginning about the transformations of Clare, the physical transformations of the buildings, are to be contrasted and at the same time contemporized with the fellowship, the students, and all the servants of the college. And it is this double aspect of any institution that seems to me the cardinal thing to emphasize. You cannot have a living building without having a proper corporate entity within it. And at the same time, if it's a beautiful building, like both Clare and Westminster Abbey are, we are doubly delighted.
I think it's worth noticing that the 750th anniversary of the Abbey, going back to 1269, is not that far away from what will be the 700th anniversary of Clare, founded in 1326. And I do think that one of the things that both the Abbey and Clare have in common is this extraordinary continuity over a very, very long span of time, with a constant capacity for change and renewal. As evidenced, for instance, in the Abbey by the construction of the Queen's Galleries, and as evidenced by the work that's being done on Old Court and all these new facilities that are being added to the college. And I think this sense of institutions surviving over a long span of time is a great comfort in the difficult times that we find ourselves in now. But also, I think the reason they have, in some senses, survived for so long is because of this constant capacity for renewal. And I think that both the Abbey and indeed Clare, both of them show great vitality in that way. And that's one of the many reasons why Clare is worth supporting.
David, thank you. Jamie, thank you. And thank all of you who are here tonight. You're a group of people who have been generous to the college, have been steadfast by the college, and we couldn't be who we are without you. And it is a community of students and fellows and staff, and we're all grateful for your support. And I know the Master echoes that too. And right now we want to bring you some of those students, two wonderful instrumentalists who are going to do a short interlude of music to finish us up tonight. And then we can all wave goodbye to each other. And we will gather again here at Clare as soon as it's safe to do so. But David, Jamie, thank you so much. Alan, thank you for all you do and your comments. Thank you, Tony. And Sophie, if you could start the music.
Hello, my name is Hannah. I am a first-year music student at Clare. It's a real treat to be performing for you tonight. We're going to be playing a duo by Hofmeister, and it's such a privilege to perform for you in this beautiful chapel and make music here once again. This is a thank you for all your generous donations and support of Clare College.
Hello, I'm Will, and I'm a second-year music student at Clare, and like Hannah, I also sing in the choir. The piece we're bringing you tonight is typical of Hofmeister, who was a contemporary of Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven, and indeed was a prolific publisher of their works in Vienna. It's very joyous and C major, bright, airy, and we hope you enjoy it.
Well, thank you all for being here. And a couple of people mentioned on the chat privately, we have new recording equipment in the chapel, thanks to a benefactor. So we're able to bring you those images, thanks to some generosity. And also playing on another channel tonight, you could have tuned into Evensong now, which you can do. So we'll send a reminder about how you can do that. College life carries on in new ways. So thank you all. Tony, any last words from you?
And just to thank everybody for actually a very fascinating evening. So thank you to our guest performers, and thank you also to our musicians. And thanks to everybody also for joining us. I thought it was a really worthwhile occasion. And I wish everybody well, and I hope you all keep safe, and that we're going to get through, hopefully as soon as possible, these particular current horror story, and that life will resume at Clare College as we once knew it. But we're doing our best. But thanks very much indeed, everybody. Nice to see you all. And
Good night,
thanks,
everybody.
Bill, as well for comparing this. Very kind.
Soon.